Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the Daily Discourse. Tonight we're on part 2 out of several, answering the question, why God? So if you're just tuning in, this is part 2 of a series. You can listen to this one independently. For more context, I can leave a link in the description for part 1 of this series, just to kind of put it in a better full package, but you should be able to follow along independently with this one. Yesterday's introduction to the topic mentioned the idea of happiness. So today, clarification on happiness. And when talking about abstractions like this, I usually try to begin with talking about peace for the sake of the visualization. So we're sitting on the beach watching the sunset, and the breeze is cool, and the sand is still warm from the daytime. And the sky is just this beautiful display of evening colors. And the sound of the waves is just gentle in the background, and the air has this subtle perfume of wildflowers growing up in the dunes. And so I can say how peaceful all of this is. And correct, peaceful, full of peace. And peace is a word to describe something that is indescribable, yet we know what it is. And that's because it is already something that is within us. So our being understands peace. So I can use that word, and most folks will be able to relate to what I'm talking about. So I tell that story, and as you listen, you are understanding peace. Something inside is stirred. So when I say how peaceful, you can perhaps relate. And without me having to describe in detail how I felt, I just paint the scene of tangible senses. And yet we can put those pieces together and arrive at this general understanding of what peace is, relaxation, and so forth. So happiness is the same. We already know what real happiness is. We know this because, like peace, it's something that's already within. And this is like completely fundamental, because from this point, right, we have to acknowledge that this true and pure happiness, genuine happiness, is a result of selflessness. Like the idea of peace, right? It just is, and this as well, right? It's without self. It's just there, happiness. So it is a direct result of selflessness. You return something that someone had lost, or you give your hat to someone who needs it, or you are at a friend's house and you clean the dishes without their knowing. These things, more often than not, create this good feeling inside. But we didn't seek anything in return for those actions. So happiness is like that. We don't seek it. It's just there when we're not expecting it. It's just this natural state. And in society, we try and take the path of least resistance, in more examples than not. But I guess it doesn't make it easy to think this way, right? And being selfless all the time is not easy as it is, and sometimes it can be draining. So society, it tries to find things to replicate that feeling. And I guess in a way, it tries to commercialize on it, because we can sell these natural components of our being, right? Love, community, happiness. If you look at any television commercial or magazine advertisement, well, not any, but most, if you look at social media, purposefully or not, culture builds a world that is void of this true happiness. Void of it because it's difficult to find when people are overworked and overstimulated and taught that this is okay. And so society's rubric, it has no real priority for selflessness. So in a way, you become deprived of this natural feeling. And so the cultural solution, again with this path of least resistance, right, is to try and sell it to you. Buy this to be happy. Drive this car and drive it on a winding road and you will be happy. Eat this and you will have friends and be happy. And so we're set up for this cycle of trying to find happiness, like it is something that we're missing. And we feel that void because it's something that we innately understand, something that it's already a part of us. And so when it's not there, we do feel like we're missing it. And when it's sold to us, we feel like that's what we need to fill that void. We're shown that we're missing it. And because we don't have the things that everyone else who looks so happy has, that must be the reason. So it makes it always seem like it's just out of reach. And so we buy the car, and it makes us happy for a little while. We dress in a certain way to attract certain friends, and that makes us happy for a little while. All of these little peaks that we have, they're just enough to satisfy that desire, right? To remind us that we do enjoy feeling happiness. And it's just an illusion of what that real happiness is. But because we're already seeking it, right, it's just satisfying it just enough. I guess the result of this, though, is that the rest of our time then, after this little peak fades away, is a general unhappiness, looking for how to make us happy again. So, as was said in part one of this discourse, right, life is not about making you happy. We have this general idea in life that we need to do what makes us happy. And I don't mean not following your dreams, although perhaps that could use some self-reflection in itself. But I'm speaking about those fleeting, immediate forms of happiness that many people constantly seek. It's this obsessive way of acting. Culture makes us believe that happiness is this thing we can buy. And it's built into this instant gratification format of our contemporary society. Look at social media, for instance, and not to pass judgment on any of this, but just simply acknowledging it as people posting pictures of themselves on vacation at the beach, all to try and maybe convince us that they're happy, or to convince themselves that it's making them happy. And perhaps there is happiness there, but not that pure happiness that we experience when we have no expectations of happiness, right? Our levels of joy should not depend on who likes or comments on what I'm doing. It does not work that way. And while it might seem like it is, right, that's not this lasting satisfaction that I'm referring to. So to tie this closer into part one of the conversation, so we understand that life is maybe not about getting what we want all the time. Life is instead about cooperating with God's will for us, learning to cooperate with God's will, because God is love, God's plan is love. And when we partake in God's plan, we partake in his love. So this implies, again, self-denial and a discipline to maintain that course. And when we do, we experience this deeper, more lasting happiness. And it's different than the immediate satisfactions of desires. So we look at religion in regards to this, and now religion, it's not supposed to provide this fleeting happiness. It may make you happy, which is a wonderful thing, but it is important to consider, right, that part of it is to just reinforce these guidelines and structures for us to live by, that we may discover a more lasting happiness. So it's not necessarily to repress, but to guide us. And by grace, we learn the joy of this structuring. And when we, in a way, conform to it, fit into this guideline, it becomes much simpler to understand our kind of day-to-day reactions and whatnot. I went over more on that in part one, so I'm just going to breeze by it right now, because I want to stay focused on religion in the sense that it helps us reshape our conscience. So when we experience God's love, we become obligated to reform our internal workings, and doing this in a way that our conscience then will judge us as if God himself was judging. This sounds repressive to some people, but don't see it in that light, right? See it again as helping you to establish these guidelines to benefit you in the long run, like giving up that candy for dinner and having a health promoting meal that will again benefit you in the long run. It's that same sort of structuring, and religion helps us establish that. And, this framework is already clearly provided. It's like a roadmap, and it's all in scripture. It's all in these teachings that are so accessible, especially in the United States, where we don't have to worry about the things that certain religious groups have to worry about around the world. And in light of this, right, if we look at the stream of our selfish behaviors, so let's say, and I don't, just an example, but let's say I feel lonely, right? And then so lust enters my mind because that's how I will address my loneliness. So I dress real fancy and I clean myself up and I go to the bar and I find an attractive young lady in the room and I pretend to listen very intently, but I'm just thinking about the desire that led me here to begin with. So then I say all the wonderful things about myself to swoon them. And now all of this deception and usury for the sake of satisfying my own desire for lust or to fulfill a fear of being lonely. And often after we get what we want, we realize that it's not enough anymore. So we're off seeking the next thing to keep filling this emptiness that mentioned earlier in this particular talk. So when we reshape our internal workings down to the very foundations, we deny ourselves many of these luxuries in order to truly and genuinely give ourselves to others, to give and expect nothing in return, right? Just like the sun in this two farmers story from part one. And without going into that story, right, look at the sun. It just shines and shines and it expects nothing in return. And God is like this. And when we have no expectations, everything is a blessing. And this is where we find happiness, or better put, this is where, in a sense, happiness finds us. We think that we need to be happy in the wrong sense of the word all of the time. And if we are not happy, then something must be wrong with us. So look at Jonah with that in mind, and look at the prodigal son. And sometimes that unsettled feeling that something must be wrong with us feeling is because we're so far out of step with what our soul innately knows, that our soul is truly seeking that true happiness, that true selfless love, that contemplation of God, gratitude and peace. So what it comes down to is that work that we have to do to reshape our conscience, that it can guide us along this path of self-reflection and self-discipline and self-denial and keep us on that narrow way. With this knowledge then is the obligation that we have then to act accordingly, because we need to truly desire our spiritual development, that we can align ourselves with humility to God's plan and to God's way of living for us, that we may cooperate, work in cooperation with God's plan. And God is waiting for us. Scripture tells us this beautiful line that the Lord makes plowshares from swords. And in this, right, he doesn't replace the swords with plowshares. He transforms the swords into plowshares. And he transforms us as we are, as out of step or as lost as we might feel. He takes that very material of us and transforms us into, repurposes us into something that is in line with his plan on earth, which is love. And it's in when we're in line with this, we experience this deeper happiness. We feel in connection to this. And we have to try and let go of this idea of instant gratification, or at least become aware of how it functions in life. It's different for everyone, but if we minimize its promptings, we can begin that process of developing self-discipline and put your trust in God and seek that true and deep, lasting love. Ask God for help in this process. Like I said, he's there waiting for you. And religion is here to help us become selfless. The process of selflessness is literally to transcend oneself. It is where pure love exists. Love without attachment, love without judgment, love without agenda or desire, just plain simple love, pure love. And pure because it's not tarnished by the stains of self-will. And I mean, in this is selflessness, and this is genuine, real happiness. Happiness because it doesn't seek happiness as its own result. It's just a result of selflessness and thus God. And again, I think to reiterate this idea, I find often people are turned off by the idea of religion and seeing it as this mechanism for teaching selflessness, teaching transcendence. So we must transcend ourselves. Psychologist William James talked about this, and has some interesting things on religious experience, how important that is. When we look at contemporary society that's become detached from this inner happiness, it does not have religion to teach them self-transcendence. And so people turn to other ways of filling that void, seeking these impermanent pleasures. It's like being spiritually malnourished. So naturally, we'll try and satisfy that hunger with anything that comes up. Thomas Merton gives this wonderfully humorous in how it's presented, but a very clear example is speaking towards why folks resort to drugs and alcohol, that people have this innate desire to transcend themselves. When you don't have religion to help you through that process, right, this is where Father Lewis Merton says, you go down to the liquor store and, paraphrasing here, you buy a bottle of something or another and you down it really quick and you can transcend yourself rather immediately. And in a way, right, this is the way society is structured. It enables this cycle. And the religious spiritual process is long and can be a difficult one, but it is immensely beautiful and fulfilling, like having a garden, right? You don't just have flowers, you have to labor and you have to weed and you have to be in the sun and accept the natural movement of things as they are, the rain. And you have to really tend and love this garden. It requires a full amount of attention, but the fruits of this are beautiful. And it's important to see the religious and spiritual process this way, or I believe it's important to, at least. Because right, the real joy is this process. It allows us to become closer and closer to God, and this is that journey. So the further along that we are focused on this, the more empty of ourselves we become. And just like happiness, right, we innately seek this relation to God. But again, it's a dedication to a longer process. It's a refining process. It's that narrow way that we must let go to fit down. But we seek this immediate satisfaction through vices and distractions. And the further we are from the truth that we know deep inside, the more we feel unhappy. And so the more we seek those external pleasures. It may be material goods, approval from other people, alcohol, drugs, clinging too closely to our emotions. Then it can become this cycle. But like Jonah in the whale's stomach, it's in humility. Turn to God. God will guide you. Turn back towards religion. Seek this above all other things. Make this the priority. Become focused on it, and everything else is in the periphery. It still exists, but you see it in a different light. Everything that we do must be worthy of God because we have been shown great love by Him. To have this perspective shift, to see things this way. Do you want to feel good because you did what you wanted? Or do you want to feel good because you did the right thing in a situation? Good may come from giving up what we think we want or we need, speaking physically and emotionally. Not all the time, but being able to know yourself enough to differentiate between the two. In a way, right, it's this leaving of that childlike way of living, leaving it behind. And I mean that in the sense of childlike in fulfilling desires on impulse, having tantrums and following these emotional peaks up and down. We have to leave that. We don't have to, but highly suggested, acknowledging it within yourself and leaving it behind. And I think that this is a place to really consider the importance, or what we consider important in our lives, to filter all of that through this. And tomorrow this discourse will continue, but this tangent seemed necessary because it presupposes that we have this desire to seek spiritual development, not to do it in our own way, but that we need to directly respond to God calling us back to His statutes, to have the desire to want to change ourselves from the bottom up and from the inside out, and shift the perspective of what happiness is, of what joy is, of what love is, of what life is, of what God is, of what religion is. Because the original question was, why God? And while we'll talk about it more, I'll talk about it more to the best of my ability tomorrow and perhaps the day after that, the answer is very simple. Why God? But because there's nothing else. Everything is in Him. But it starts with that internal dialogue. It starts with that feeling uncomfortable with your desires or maybe where you are. Because if we're comfortable, we're not going to want to get up and move. But if that feeling is sitting there and it's unpleasant, acknowledge it and self-reflect, have that internal dialogue, and seeking that selflessness and considering the idea of happiness and seeking His way, God's way. This will bring us real, deep, lasting peace because we're not seeking it, not for the sake of having a goal. It's just something that's graciously given to us. So, as always, I guess thank you for listening. I suppose this is a good place to end this one. And as I said, we'll pick up tomorrow, probably more directly in line to yesterday's conversation. So thank you so much. And Lord willing, see you tomorrow, 7 p.m.